The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Kensington Palace as Princess Charlotte walked through the corridors she had known since childhood. Her footsteps echoed softly against the high ceilings, each sound a reminder of the weight of tradition that surrounded her daily life. At 23, she had grown accustomed to the formalities and expectations that came with being third in line to the throne, but today felt different somehow. Charlotte paused before the large portrait of her great-grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, whose steady gaze seemed to follow her wherever she went in the palace. The painting captured the late monarch's unwavering dignity and strength, qualities that Charlotte often wondered if she possessed herself. She touched the simple pearl necklace at her throat, a gift from her grandmother on her 18th birthday, and drew a deep breath. "Your Highness," came a gentle voice from behind her. Charlotte turned to see Mrs. Henderson, her private secretary, approaching with her usual morning briefing folder. The elderly woman had served the royal family for over 30 years and had become something of a surrogate grandmother to Charlotte and her brothers. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson," Charlotte replied, accepting the folder with a warm smile. "I trust you slept well." "Indeed, Your Highness. Though I must say, there's quite a bit of excitement in the air today." Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled with a knowing look that made Charlotte curious. Before Charlotte could inquire further, the sound of approaching footsteps drew their attention. Prince Richard rounded the corner, his tall frame cutting an impressive figure in his navy morning suit. At 28, he possessed the easy confidence that came naturally to the heir apparent, but there was something different about his demeanor this morning, a nervous energy that was unusual for someone typically so composed. "Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying a note of formality that surprised her. "Might I have a word with you in the blue drawing room?" Charlotte exchanged a glance with Mrs. Henderson, who simply nodded and stepped back discreetly. "Of course, Richard," she replied, following her older brother down the hallway. The blue drawing room had always been one of Charlotte's favorite spaces in the palace. The pale blue silk wallpaper and elegant Regency furniture created an atmosphere of refined tranquility that she found comforting during times of stress or uncertainty. Today, however, the room felt charged with an anticipation she couldn't quite identify. Richard moved to the window that overlooked the palace gardens, where the late spring flowers were beginning to bloom in carefully manicured beds. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a pose Charlotte recognized from their childhood when he was preparing to deliver serious news. "You seem unusually formal this morning, brother," Charlotte observed, settling into one of the silk-upholstered chairs. "Has something happened?" Richard turned from the window, and Charlotte was struck by the gravity in his expression. His dark eyes, so similar to their father's, held a mixture of excitement and solemnity that made her heart skip a beat. "Charlotte, what I'm about to share with you has been months in the planning," he began, moving to sit across from her. "Father and I have been working closely with the palace administration and the crown jewelers to arrange something rather extraordinary." Charlotte felt a flutter of nervous anticipation in her stomach. In their family, extraordinary announcements often came with significant responsibilities or life-changing expectations. She thought of her youngest brother, Edward, who at 19 was still finishing his studies at Cambridge, blissfully unaware of the complex machinations that governed their daily lives. "I'm listening," she said simply, though her voice betrayed a slight tremor. Richard leaned forward, his hands clasped together. "You know that our roles within the family have been evolving, particularly as father prepares for his eventual coronation. The palace has been considering how best to modernize certain traditions while maintaining the dignity and historical significance of the crown." Charlotte nodded, having been part of numerous discussions about the monarchy's adaptation to contemporary times. It was a delicate balance between honoring centuries of tradition and remaining relevant to a rapidly changing world. "Tomorrow evening, there will be a private ceremony in the throne room," Richard continued. "A very select gathering, just immediate family, senior palace officials, and a few representatives from the Commonwealth realms. The purpose is to formally present you with a selection of the crown jewels that will be designated for your use in your official duties. The words hit Charlotte like a gentle wave, washing over her with a mixture of honor and overwhelming responsibility. The crown jewels were not merely precious stones and metals. They were symbols of 1,000 years of British history, worn by queens and princesses who had shaped the destiny of nations. "Which pieces?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Cambridge sapphire parure, including the tiara, necklace, earrings, and brooch," Richard replied, watching her face carefully for her reaction. "Also, the Queen Mary Diamond Riviere and several other significant pieces that Father believes will be appropriate for your growing role in representing the crown." Charlotte felt her breath catch in her throat. The Cambridge sapphire parure had been a favorite of Queen Elizabeth II and had been worn at some of the most important state occasions in recent history. The deep blue sapphires, surrounded by brilliant diamonds, were considered among the most beautiful pieces in the entire collection. "I'm honored beyond words," Charlotte managed to say, though she felt a strange mixture of excitement and trepidation. "But Richard, what about Edward? Surely as a male member of the family, he should be included in such an important ceremony." Richard's expression shifted slightly, and for the first time that morning, Charlotte detected a hint of discomfort in his manner. He stood and walked back to the window, his shoulders tense beneath his perfectly tailored jacket. "Father, and I discussed Edward's participation at length," he said carefully. "The decision was made that this particular ceremony should focus on you and your specific role within the family structure. Edward's time will come, but his current priorities are his education and personal development." Charlotte studied her brother's profile as he gazed out at the gardens. There was something he wasn't telling her, some aspect of this decision that troubled him. She knew Richard well enough to recognize when he was choosing his words with particular care. "Has Edward been told about the ceremony?" she asked. "He will be informed of the general details, naturally," Richard replied, still not meeting her gaze. "Though the specific nature of the jewel presentation may not be immediately shared with him." A cold feeling settled in Charlotte's stomach. Edward might be the youngest of the three siblings, but he was still a senior member of the royal family. To exclude him from such a significant event seemed unnecessarily harsh and potentially damaging to the family dynamics they had all worked so hard to maintain. "Richard, I need you to be completely honest with me," Charlotte said, rising from her chair and moving to stand beside him at the window. "What's really behind this decision? Why is Edward being left out?" Richard finally turned to face her, and she could see the conflict in his eyes. There have been concerns about Edward's discretion lately. Some of his university friendships and social activities have raised questions about his judgment. Father believes it's prudent to limit his exposure to sensitive family matters until he demonstrates greater maturity. Charlotte felt a surge of protective concern for her younger brother. Edward had always been the most spirited of the three siblings, with a natural charm and rebellious streak that occasionally put him at odds with palace protocol. But to exclude him from family ceremonies seemed like a punishment that could drive him further away from his royal duties rather than encouraging his growth within them. "What kind of concerns?" she pressed. "Nothing scandalous," Richard assured her quickly. "But there have been reports of late-night parties, associations with individuals who might not have the family's best interests at heart, and a general attitude of casualness about his position that has made some advisors uncomfortable." Charlotte absorbed this information with growing unease. She knew Edward had been struggling with the constraints of royal life, particularly as he watched his university friends enjoy freedoms that were largely denied to him. The constant scrutiny and expectations that came with their birthright affected each of them differently, and Edward had always been the most resistant to the formal structures that governed their existence. "So the solution is to shut him out?" Charlotte asked, unable to keep a note of criticism from her voice. "The solution is to help him understand that privileges come with responsibilities," Richard replied firmly. Father believes that seeing you honored for your dedication and service might motivate Edward to take his own role more seriously. Charlotte turned away from the window, her mind racing with the implications of what she was hearing. The ceremony that should have been a moment of pure joy and honor was now complicated by family politics and disciplinary measures that she had never asked for. "I don't want to be used as an example to teach Edward a lesson," she said quietly. "That's not fair to any of us." Richard moved to her side and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Charlotte, this isn't about punishment or favoritism. It's about recognizing the remarkable work you've done over the past several years. Your charitable foundations, your diplomatic missions, your representation of the family at state functions. You've earned this recognition through your own merit." She knew he was right about her accomplishments. Since completing her university education, Charlotte had thrown herself into royal duties with a dedication that had impressed even the most traditional palace observers. Her work with children's charities had gained international recognition, and her natural grace during official functions had made her increasingly valuable as a representative of the modern monarchy. But at what cost? She wondered aloud. If this ceremony damages my relationship with Edward, then the honor feels hollow. Edward will understand in time, Richard said with more confidence than Charlotte felt was warranted. He's young, and youth often comes with poor judgment. This may be exactly what he needs to mature into his role. Charlotte wasn't convinced, but she could see that Richard had already accepted the decision as final. She knew her father well enough to understand that once his mind was made up about family matters, there was little room for negotiation. "When will you tell him?" she asked. "Tonight, after dinner," Richard replied. "I'll explain the situation and help him understand why this approach is in everyone's best interest." Charlotte nodded, though she felt a growing sense of dread about how that conversation might unfold. Edward had inherited their mother's passionate temperament along with her striking blue eyes, and she could easily imagine his hurt and anger at being excluded from such an important family event. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of routine activities, but Charlotte found it difficult to concentrate on her usual duties. During her weekly meeting with the heads of her various charitable organizations, she caught herself staring out the window and thinking about Edward. When her private secretary briefed her on upcoming engagements, she found herself wondering how her brother would react to the news of his exclusion. Lunch was served in the small dining room, where Charlotte was joined by her aunt, Princess, and who was visiting to discuss plans for an upcoming state visit, and had always been Charlotte's favorite relative, with her no-nonsense attitude and refreshing directness about royal life. "You seem distracted today, dear," and observed as they shared a light meal of salmon and salad. "Something troubling you?" Charlotte hesitated, unsure how much she should reveal about the upcoming ceremony. Palace protocol dictated discretion about internal family matters, but she desperately needed someone to talk to about her concerns. "There's to be a presentation ceremony tomorrow evening," she said carefully. "I'm to receive some pieces from the crown jewels collection for my official use." Anne's eyebrows rose with interest. "That's wonderful news, Charlotte. A significant honor and long overdue, if you ask me." "Which pieces?" "The Cambridge sapphire parure, among others." "Magnificent choice," and said with approval. "Those sapphires will be spectacular on you. I remember when your grandmother wore them to the state banquet for the French president in 1984. Absolutely stunning." Charlotte managed to smile, though her heart wasn't entirely in it. "I'm honored, truly. It's just that Edward won't be included in the ceremony." Anne's expression shifted immediately, her fork pausing halfway to her mouth. "I see. And I assume there's a specific reason for this exclusion." "Concerns about his judgment and associations at university," Charlotte explained quietly, and set down her fork and leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "Your brother is at a difficult age for any young man, but particularly for one in his position. The freedoms that other 19-year-olds take for granted are scrutinized and judged when you're third in line to the throne. Do you think excluding him is the right approach?" Charlotte asked, genuinely seeking her aunt's wisdom. "I think," and said carefully, "that there are rarely easy answers when it comes to balancing family dynamics with royal duties. Your father is trying to guide Edward toward a greater sense of responsibility, but isolation can sometimes achieve the opposite effect." Charlotte felt a wave of relief at having her concerns validated by someone she respected so deeply. "That's exactly what I'm afraid of." Edward already feels constrained by his position. If he believes the family is actively working against him, he might withdraw even further, or he might rebel more dramatically, and added grimly, "I've seen it happen before, though not in recent generations, thankfully." They finished their lunch in thoughtful silence, both women aware of the delicate balance required to maintain family unity while upholding the responsibilities of their positions. As and prepared to leave, she placed a reassuring hand on Charlotte's arm. "Trust your instincts, dear," she said quietly. "You know your brother better than the palace advisors do. Sometimes family loyalty requires difficult conversations, even when they go against official decisions." Charlotte spent the rest of the afternoon in her private study, attempting to focus on correspondence and briefing materials for upcoming engagements. But her thoughts kept returning to Edward and the conversation Richard would have with him that evening. She imagined her brother's face when he learned about the ceremony, pictured the hurt and confusion that would inevitably follow. As the afternoon light began to fade, Charlotte made a decision that she knew might complicate her own position, but felt necessary for the sake of her family relationships. She would speak with Edward herself before Richard had the chance to deliver the official explanation. If her brother was going to be hurt by this decision, at least he would hear about it from someone who shared his concerns about the fairness of the situation. The evening dinner was scheduled for 7 o'clock, a formal affair with their father, King William, joining them in the main dining room. It would be one of the last family meals before tomorrow's ceremony, and Charlotte dreaded the underlying tensions that would inevitably surface during the conversation. She had 3 hours to find Edward and prepare him for what was coming. 3 hours to try to preserve some measure of family unity in the face of a decision that threatened to drive a wedge between the siblings who had always stood together against the pressures of their extraordinary lives. Charlotte rose from her desk and walked to the window of her study, where the palace gardens were bathed in the golden light of early evening. Tomorrow, she would wear sapphires that had adorned queens and represent centuries of tradition and service. But tonight, she was simply a sister who refused to let protocol destroy the bonds that mattered most to her. The decision about what to do next would define not just her relationship with Edward, but her understanding of what it truly meant to serve both the crown and her family with equal dedication. Charlotte found Edward in the palace library, a vast room lined with leather-bound volumes that stretched from floor to ceiling. He was slouched in one of the antique wingback chairs, completely absorbed in what appeared to be a modern thriller novel rather than the historical text that surrounded him. His dark blonde hair fell across his forehead in a way that reminded Charlotte of their mother, and for a moment she was struck by how young he still looked despite being nearly 20. "Escaping into fiction again?" she asked softly, not wanting to startle him. Edward looked up with a grin that immediately transformed his serious expression into something much more boyish and carefree. "Charlotte, I didn't hear you come in. And yes, guilty as charged. Sometimes I need a break from all the worthy literature that everyone expects me to read." Charlotte settled into the chair beside him, noting the slight tension in his shoulders that suggested he wasn't as relaxed as he appeared. "What's this one about?" "International espionage. Impossible odds. A hero who saves the world against all expectations," Edward replied with mock gravity. "You know, the usual fantasy of having complete control over one's destiny and making decisions that actually matter." The bitter edge to his joke didn't escape Charlotte's notice. She had always been attuned to her youngest brother's moods, and she could sense the underlying frustration that had been building in him over recent months. His final year at Cambridge should have been a time of excitement and anticipation for the future, but instead he seemed increasingly trapped by the expectations and restrictions of royal life. "Edward," she began carefully, We need to talk about something important. The change in her tone immediately caught his attention. He closed the book and turned to face her fully, his blue eyes searching her face for clues about what was coming. "That sounds ominous," he said, though he was clearly trying to maintain a light tone. "Have I done something wrong? Because I swear the incident with the punting boat was completely accidental, and the newspaper photos made it look much worse than it actually was." Despite her concerns, Charlotte couldn't help but smile at his reference to the minor scandal that had erupted 2 weeks earlier when Edward had fallen out of a punt during a river party with his university friends. The tabloids had made it seem like a wild display of irresponsible behavior, though Charlotte knew it had simply been an unfortunate accident during what was otherwise an innocent afternoon outing. "It's not about the punting," she assured him, "though you might want to consider staying away from boats for a while." "Noted," Edward replied with a small laugh. "So what is it then? You look like you're about to deliver some rather serious news." Charlotte took a deep breath, knowing that there was no gentle way to share what she had learned. "Tomorrow evening, there's going to be a ceremony in the throne room. Father and Richard have arranged for me to receive several pieces from the crown jewels collection for my official use." Edward's expression brightened immediately. "Charlotte, that's incredible. Which pieces? When is the ceremony? This is such an honor. You absolutely deserve this recognition." His genuine enthusiasm and lack of any sense that he might be excluded from such an event made Charlotte's heart ache. She could see his mind already racing with excitement, probably imagining himself standing beside her during the ceremony, sharing in what should be a proud moment for their entire family. "The Cambridge sapphire parure and several other pieces," she continued, watching his face carefully. "It will be a small, private ceremony, just immediate family and senior palace officials." "That sounds perfect," Edward said, his excitement undiminished. "Intimate and meaningful rather than some massive state production. When should I plan to be back from Cambridge? I can easily arrange to miss lectures for something this important." Charlotte felt as if her heart might break. She could see the exact moment when her next words would shatter his expectations and hurt him in a way that might permanently damage their relationship. "Edward, there's something else you need to know," she said quietly. "The decision has been made that you won't be attending the ceremony." The change in Edward's expression was immediate and devastating. The excitement and joy drained from his face, replaced by confusion and then a dawning sense of hurt that made Charlotte want to gather him in her arms the way she had when he was small and had fallen from his bicycle. "I don't understand," he said slowly. "Did I misunderstand something? Is this not a family ceremony?" "It is a family ceremony," Charlotte replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But Father and Richard have decided that your attendance wouldn't be appropriate at this time." Edward stared at her for a long moment, and Charlotte could practically see him processing this information and trying to make sense of what felt like a betrayal from the people who were supposed to support him unconditionally. "Because of the parties?" he asked quietly. "Because I've been having a normal university experience instead of sitting in my room studying constitutional law every night?" Charlotte was struck by the maturity in his question. Despite his youth, Edward understood the political calculations that governed their family's decisions. He knew that his recent social activities had been noticed and discussed by palace advisors who were always concerned about public perception and potential scandals. "They're concerned about some of your associations and activities," she explained, hating herself for having to justify a decision she fundamentally disagreed with. "Father believes that you need to demonstrate greater seriousness about your royal duties before being included in significant ceremonies. So I'm being punished," Edward said, and Charlotte was surprised by the flatness in his voice rather than the anger she had expected. "I'm being taught a lesson by being excluded from my own sister's honor." "That's not how I see it," Charlotte said firmly. "And that's not how I want it to be." Edward stood up abruptly and walked to one of the tall windows that overlooked the palace courtyard. Charlotte could see the tension in his shoulders and the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She knew him well enough to recognize that he was fighting to control his emotions and maintain some semblance of dignity in the face of what felt like a public humiliation. "You know what the worst part is?" he said without turning around. "It's not that they don't trust me or that they think I'm irresponsible. It's that they're using you to send me a message. They're making your achievement into a weapon against me." Charlotte felt tears prick at her eyes because she realized he was absolutely right. The ceremony that should have been purely about recognizing her service and dedication had been turned into a tool for family discipline, and it made the entire honor feel tainted. "Edward, I want you to know that I had no part in this decision," she said, rising to join him at the window. "If I had been consulted, I would have insisted that you be included." He finally turned to face her, and she could see unshed tears in his eyes that he was clearly determined not to let fall. "I know that, Charlotte. This isn't your fault, and I'm not angry with you. But I need you to understand something." She waited, knowing that whatever he was about to say would be important and probably painful for both of them. "I've been trying so hard to be what they want me to be," he continued, his voice tight with emotion. "I've followed all the protocols, attended all the required events, maintained appropriate relationships with suitable people. But I'm 19 years old, and sometimes I just want to be a normal university student who can go to parties and make friends without worrying about whether every conversation might be reported back to palace security." Charlotte reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "I understand that more than you might think." "Do you?" Edward asked, and there was a challenge in his voice that surprised her. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you've found the perfect balance. You do your royal duties beautifully, you're admired by everyone, and you're being rewarded with crown jewels. Meanwhile, I can't even attend a river party without it becoming a crisis of confidence in my character." Charlotte realized that Edward's perspective on her life was quite different from her own experience of it. He saw her success and recognition without understanding the sacrifices and pressures that came with it. He didn't see the nights she lay awake worrying about whether she was living up to expectations or the relationship she had ended because the other person couldn't handle the constraints of royal life. "Edward, my life isn't as perfect as it might seem from the outside," she said gently. "Every choice I make is scrutinized. Every relationship is analyzed for political implications. Every public appearance is calculated for maximum benefit to the family's reputation. Sometimes I feel like I'm disappearing behind the role I'm expected to play." Edward studied her face, and she could see him considering her words. "Then why do you do it? Why don't you push back against the expectations the way I do?" It was a fair question, and Charlotte took a moment to consider her answer. "Because I believe in what we represent," she said finally. "I believe that our family can make a positive difference in people's lives, and I want to be part of that legacy. But that doesn't mean I agree with every decision that's made in the name of maintaining a reputation. Like the decision to exclude me from tomorrow's ceremony," Edward said. Exactly like that decision. They stood together at the window, watching the afternoon light fade over the palace grounds. Charlotte could feel the weight of the conversation between them, the way it was forcing both of them to articulate feelings and frustrations they had never fully expressed before. "What am I supposed to do?" Edward asked finally. "If I continue being myself, I'll be increasingly excluded from family events. But if I become the perfect royal robot they seem to want, I'll lose whatever authentic part of myself I have left." Charlotte turned to face him fully, taking both of his hands in hers. "You don't have to choose between being yourself and being a good royal. But you might need to be more strategic about how you express your independence." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you can have university friends and attend parties and live a relatively normal life, but you need to be more careful about public perception. The palace advisors aren't necessarily wrong about the risks. Every photograph, every story, every association can be turned into a scandal by people who want to damage our family." Edward nodded slowly, and Charlotte could see that he was beginning to understand the complexity of their situation. "So, I need to be smarter about protecting myself and the family, but I don't have to give up having a life." "Exactly. And I think if you demonstrate that level of awareness and discretion, Father and Richard will begin to trust your judgment more. But what about tomorrow's ceremony? Edward asked. The damage is already done as far as that's concerned. Charlotte had been dreading this part of their conversation, but she knew she had to share her decision with him. I've been thinking about that, and I want you to know that if you're not there tomorrow night, the ceremony won't feel complete to me. Charlotte, you can't boycott your own honor because of me, Edward said firmly. That would only make things worse for everyone. I'm not talking about boycotting, she replied, but I'm going to make it clear to Father and Richard that I expect you to be included in future family ceremonies, and that I consider your exclusion from this one to be a mistake. Edward smiled for the first time since she had shared the news with him. You don't have to fight my battles for me, but I appreciate knowing that you would. We're family, Charlotte said simply. Fighting for each other is what we do. They were interrupted by the soft chiming of the clock tower, indicating that it was nearly time for the evening meal. Charlotte knew that Richard would be planning to speak with Edward after dinner, and she wondered how that conversation would go now that Edward had been prepared for what was coming. Richard is planning to talk to you tonight after dinner, she told him. He'll probably explain the official reasoning behind the decision, and I'll listen respectfully and accept the explanation graciously, Edward replied, though there was a slight edge to his voice. But I won't pretend to agree with it. Just remember that Richard isn't the enemy here, Charlotte cautioned. He's trying to balance Father's wishes with what he thinks is best for the family. It's not an easy position for him either. Edward considered this for a moment. You're right. I know Richard cares about both of us. It's just frustrating to feel like decisions about my life are being made without any input from me. That's something you should tell him tonight, Charlotte suggested. Not in an angry or accusatory way, but as a mature conversation about your role in family decisions going forward. As they prepared to leave the library for dinner, Edward caught Charlotte's arm gently. Thank you for telling me about this yourself. It means more than you know that you trusted me with the truth instead of letting me be blindsided. Charlotte felt a surge of love and protectiveness toward her youngest brother. Despite his youth and occasional lapses in judgment, he had responded to difficult news with more maturity and grace than many adults would have managed. She was more convinced than ever that excluding him from the ceremony was not just unfair, but counterproductive to the family's long-term unity. We'll get through this, she told him. All of us, together. I hope so, Edward replied. Because despite everything, I do want to be part of this family's future. I just want to do it as myself, not as some idealized version of what a prince should be. As they walked toward the dining room together, Charlotte found herself thinking about the ceremony that would take place tomorrow evening. She would wear the Cambridge sapphire parure and accept the honor that came with it, but the absence of her youngest brother would cast a shadow over what should have been a moment of pure joy. She only hoped that this difficult period would ultimately strengthen their family bonds rather than fracturing them permanently. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the palace corridors, a rhythm that seemed to match the complex dance of duty, love, and loyalty that defined their lives. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult conversations, but tonight they would sit together as a family and try to navigate the delicate balance between tradition and change that would define the future of the monarchy they would someday help to lead. The formal dining room at Kensington Palace had always been a place where family dynamics played out against a backdrop of centuries-old protocol. Tonight, as Charlotte took her designated seat at the mahogany table beneath portraits of long-dead monarchs, she could feel the undercurrents of tension that would soon surface in the conversation she knew was coming. King William entered the dining room with his characteristic measured pace, his presence immediately commanding attention despite the intimate family setting. At 55, he carried himself with the dignity that came from years of preparation for the crown, but Charlotte had always been able to see past the royal bearing to the father who had read her bedtime stories and taught her to ride horses in these same palace grounds. "Good evening, children," he said warmly, though Charlotte noticed the slight formality in his tone that suggested he was aware of the difficult conversations that lay ahead. Richard followed closely behind, and Charlotte could see the tension in her eldest brother's shoulders that indicated he was dreading the task that awaited him after dinner. Edward arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably in his dinner jacket, and presenting the picture of royal propriety that their upbringing had instilled in all three siblings. Charlotte watched him carefully as he greeted their father with perfect courtesy, and she was impressed by his composure, given what she knew he was feeling inside. "I trust your studies are going well, Edward," King William said as they began the first course, a delicate soup that none of them seemed particularly interested in eating. "Very well, father," Edward replied smoothly. "My tutors are pleased with my progress in constitutional law, and I'm finding the coursework quite engaging." Charlotte recognized the careful phrasing of Edward's response. He was demonstrating the seriousness and academic focus that he knew their father valued, while avoiding any mention of the social activities that had caused concern among palace advisors. "I'm glad to hear it," their father continued. "Your education is, of course, fundamental to your future role within the family. The knowledge you gain now will serve you throughout your life of service to the crown." The conversation continued in this politely formal manner through the soup and fish courses, with each family member carefully avoiding any topics that might lead to conflict. Charlotte found herself studying the faces around the table, trying to read the emotions that lay beneath the surface of their perfectly mannered interaction. Richard maintained his usual air of controlled competence, but Charlotte could see the way he occasionally glanced at Edward with what appeared to be genuine regret. Their father seemed determined to keep the conversation light and pleasant, perhaps hoping to avoid any unpleasantness before Richard delivered the news about tomorrow's ceremony. Edward continued to play his part perfectly, engaging in discussions about politics and current events with the intelligence and insight that reminded Charlotte why excluding him from family ceremonies was such a waste of his potential. As the main course was served, their father finally broached the topic that Charlotte knew he couldn't avoid forever. "Charlotte, I trust you're prepared for tomorrow evening's ceremony," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that always entered his tone when he spoke about her accomplishments. "It will be a significant moment, both for you personally and for your future role within the family." "I'm honored by the recognition, father," Charlotte replied carefully, "though I confess to feeling somewhat nervous about the responsibility that comes with such beautiful and historically significant pieces." "The nervousness will pass," King William assured her. "You've more than earned this honor through your dedication to your duties and your service to the people. The Cambridge sapphire parure will be magnificent on you, and I have no doubt you will wear it with the dignity it deserves." Charlotte caught Edward's eye across the table and saw him force a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She could see that he was genuinely happy for her despite his own disappointment, and it made her love him even more while simultaneously making her angrier about the decision to exclude him. "Will it be a large ceremony?" Edward asked, and Charlotte had to admire his ability to ask the question with what appeared to be casual interest rather than the deeper curiosity she knew he must be feeling. "No, quite intimate actually," their father replied. "Just immediate family and a few senior palace officials. We felt that a smaller gathering would be more appropriate for such a personal honor." Edward simply nodded, giving no indication that he understood he was being excluded from this immediate family gathering. Charlotte wondered if their father genuinely believed Edward hadn't been told about his exclusion, or if he was simply hoping to avoid addressing the issue during their meal. The conversation moved on to other topics, but Charlotte found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on the discussion of upcoming state visits and charitable engagements. She kept glancing at the clock on the mantelpiece, knowing that each passing minute brought them closer to the conversation that would shatter the careful politeness that currently filled the room. As dessert was served, Richard cleared his throat in a way that immediately drew everyone's attention. Charlotte felt her stomach tighten as she recognized the gesture that meant her eldest brother was about to address something serious. "Father, if you'll excuse me, I believe this would be an appropriate time for me to speak privately with Edward about some family matters, Richard said, his voice carefully neutral. King William nodded, though Charlotte noticed a slight tension around his eyes that suggested he was not entirely comfortable with the conversation that was about to take place. Of course, Charlotte, and I have some details about tomorrow's ceremony to review in any case. Edward set down his dessert spoon and looked around the table with an expression of polite curiosity that almost broke Charlotte's heart. Certainly, he said simply. Shall we use the blue drawing room? As the family began to disperse, Charlotte caught Edward's eye once more and tried to convey her support and love in a single look. He smiled at her with genuine warmth, and she could see that despite everything, he was drawing strength from knowing that she understood his situation and supported him. Charlotte, shall we retire to my study? Their father suggested, and she realized that she was about to have her own difficult conversation about the ceremony and its implications for family dynamics. King William's private study was a room that perfectly reflected his personality and interests. The walls were lined with books on history and political theory, while his desk was covered with the red leather dispatch boxes that contained the daily business of running a constitutional monarchy. Charlotte had spent countless hours in this room throughout her childhood, seeking her father's advice on everything from school problems to questions about her future role in the family. Tonight, however, the familiar surroundings felt charged with intention that made her uncomfortably aware of the complex relationship between her roles as daughter and princess. I want you to know how proud I am of you, Charlotte, her father began as they settled into the comfortable leather chairs beside his fireplace. The work you've done over the past several years has been exceptional, and this recognition is long overdue. Thank you, Father, she replied, though she could feel the weight of the conversation she needed to have with him about Edward's exclusion. I'm grateful for the honor, but I have some concerns about how the ceremony has been arranged. King William's expression became more guarded, and Charlotte could see that he had been expecting this conversation. I assume this is about Edward's absence from tomorrow evening's proceedings. Yes, it is, Charlotte said firmly. I understand the concerns about his recent behavior, but I believe excluding him from such an important family ceremony is counterproductive and potentially harmful to our family unity. Her father was quiet for a long moment, and Charlotte could see him considering how much to share with her about the reasoning behind the decision. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of responsibility that always seemed to burden him when making difficult choices about his children's lives. Charlotte, there are aspects of this situation that you may not fully understand, he said carefully. The concerns about Edward's judgment extend beyond simple university parties or social activities. There have been reports about some of his associations that have raised serious questions about his discretion and his understanding of his responsibilities. Charlotte felt a cold feeling in her stomach. What kind of reports? Nothing criminal or scandalous, her father assured her quickly. But there have been instances where Edward has discussed family matters with individuals who may not have our best interests at heart. There have also been occasions where he has been photographed in situations that, while innocent in themselves, could be misinterpreted or used to damage the family's reputation. Charlotte absorbed this information, trying to balance her protective instincts toward Edward with her understanding of the very real pressures and threats that constantly surrounded their family. She knew that every public appearance, every friendship, every casual conversation carried the potential for scandal or embarrassment that could damage not just their personal reputations, but the institution of the monarchy itself. Have you spoken to Edward directly about these concerns? She asked. Richard has addressed some of these issues with him, but I'm not convinced that Edward fully understands the gravity of the situation, her father replied. The decision to exclude him from tomorrow's ceremony is intended to help him recognize that his actions have consequences, not just for himself, but for all of us. Charlotte could see the logic in her father's reasoning, but she still felt that the approach was wrong. Father, with respect, I think you're underestimating Edward's intelligence and his commitment to the family. He may be young and occasionally impulsive, but he's not careless about matters that truly matter. I hope you're right, King William said, though his tone suggested he remained unconvinced. But as the future king, I have to consider not just Edward's intentions, but the impact of his actions on the monarchy as a whole. Every decision I make about family matters sends a message about what behavior is acceptable and what consequences follow from poor judgment. Charlotte realized that her father was seeing Edward's exclusion not just as a disciplinary measure, but as a public demonstration of royal standards and expectations. The ceremony wasn't just about honoring her service. It was about establishing precedents for how family members were expected to conduct themselves. But what message does it send about family loyalty? She asked. What does it say about our commitment to supporting each other through difficulties rather than abandoning each other when things become complicated? Her father's expression softened slightly, and Charlotte could see that her question had touched on something he had been struggling with himself. That's exactly the balance I'm trying to strike, he admitted. I want to support Edward and help him grow into his role, but I also have to protect the institution that he will someday help to lead. Then, perhaps the solution isn't to exclude him, but to include him with clear expectations about his behavior going forward, Charlotte suggested. Use tomorrow's ceremony as an opportunity to reinforce family unity while also establishing the standards you expect him to meet. King William considered her words for several minutes, and Charlotte could see him weighing the different implications of changing course at this late stage. She knew that reversing the decision about Edward's participation would require admitting that the initial judgment had been flawed, which was never easy for someone in her father's position. The invitations have already been sent, he said finally. The arrangements have been made based on Edward's absence. Changing course now would create its own set of complications. Charlotte felt a surge of frustration at the way protocol and logistics were being used to justify what she considered a fundamentally flawed decision. Father, surely the importance of family unity outweighs the inconvenience of adjusting arrangements. It's not just about inconvenience, Charlotte, he replied, though his tone was gentle rather than dismissive. It's about the message that constant changes and reversals send about the stability and decisiveness of royal leadership. Once a decision has been made and communicated, changing course without compelling reasons can appear weak and indecisive. Charlotte realized that they were approaching the fundamental tension that governs so many aspects of royal life, the balance between personal relationships and institutional responsibilities. Her father wasn't just speaking as Edward's father, but as the future king who had to consider how every decision would be interpreted and what precedents it would establish. Then, what can we do to minimize the damage to Edward and to our family relationships? She asked. We can ensure that this exclusion is temporary and that Edward understands exactly what he needs to do to avoid similar situations in the future, her father replied. Richard is having that conversation with him now, and I hope it will help Edward recognize the changes he needs to make in his approach to his public role. Charlotte knew that the conversation with Richard was probably not going as smoothly as her father hoped, but she also knew that pushing further on this issue tonight was unlikely to change anything. The decision had been made, and she would have to find other ways to support Edward through the consequences. I want you to know that while I accept your decision about tomorrow's ceremony, I strongly disagree with it, she said finally. And I hope that future decisions about family matters will include more consideration of the impact on our relationships with each other. Your opinion matters to me, Charlotte, her father assured her. And I hope that tomorrow evening will be a celebration that we can all look back on with pride, despite the current complications. As they prepared to leave the study, Charlotte felt a mixture of disappointment and determination. She had failed to change her father's mind about Edward's participation in the ceremony, but she had made her position clear and opened a dialogue about family decision-making that might influence future situations. The sound of voices from the direction of the blue drawing room told her that Richard's conversation with Edward was still ongoing, and She wondered how her youngest brother was handling the official explanation for his exclusion from tomorrow's ceremony. She only hoped that the family bonds that had sustained them through previous difficulties would prove strong enough to weather this latest challenge to their unity. Tomorrow would bring the ceremony that should have been a pure celebration of her achievements and her growing role within the royal family. Instead, it would be shadowed by the absence of someone whose presence would have made the honor feel complete. Charlotte only hoped that they would find a way to heal the wounds that were being opened tonight before they became permanent scars on their family relationships. The morning of the ceremony dawned gray and misty, with rain droplets clinging to the palace windows like tears. Charlotte stood in her dressing room, watching her lady-in-waiting carefully arrange the Cambridge sapphire parure on black velvet, each piece catching the light from the crystal chandeliers with an almost otherworldly brilliance. The deep blue sapphire surrounded by perfect diamonds should have filled her with excitement and pride, but instead she felt a hollow ache that she couldn't shake. "The tiara is particularly stunning, Your Highness," Lady Margaret observed as she held up the magnificent piece. "The way the sapphires complement your coloring will be absolutely perfect." Charlotte nodded, forcing a smile. "They're beautiful beyond words. I feel honored to be entrusted with pieces of such historical significance." But even as she spoke the appropriate words, Charlotte's thoughts were with Edward, who had left for Cambridge early that morning without saying goodbye to anyone. Richard had told her briefly that their conversation the previous evening had been difficult but necessary, though he had declined to share details about how Edward had received the news of his exclusion. The morning hours passed in a blur of final preparations and briefings. Charlotte met with the palace photographer to discuss the official portraits that would be taken during the ceremony. She reviewed the guest list one final time, noting the absence of Edward's name with a fresh pang of regret. She practiced walking in the formal gown she would wear, getting accustomed to the weight and movement of the elaborate silk and lace creation that had been designed specifically for this occasion. As afternoon approached, Charlotte found herself in her father's study once again, this time for a final briefing about the ceremony's significance and her role in the evening's proceedings. "The presentation will follow traditional protocols," King William explained, referring to notes prepared by the palace ceremonial office. "You'll enter the throne room accompanied by Richard, where you'll be formally presented to the assembled guests before the actual presentation of the jewels." "And the speech I'm to give afterward?" Charlotte asked, though she had already memorized every word of the brief remarks she had been asked to prepare. "Keep it short and gracious," her father advised. "Acknowledge the honor, thank the family and the crown for the trust being placed in you, and express your commitment to serving with dignity. The focus should remain on the historical significance of the moment rather than personal emotions." Charlotte wondered if the instruction about avoiding personal emotions was specifically intended to prevent her from mentioning Edward's absence, but she decided not to press the issue. She had already made her feelings clear, and nothing would be gained by continuing to argue about a decision that couldn't be changed. "Father, may I ask you something?" she said as they concluded their review of the evening schedule. "Of course. Do you ever regret the choices you've had to make in the name of duty? The personal relationships that have been complicated or damaged by the requirements of your position?" King William was quiet for a long moment, and Charlotte could see him considering not just her question, but the deeper concerns that had prompted it. When he finally answered, his voice carried a weariness that she had rarely heard from him before. "Every day," he said simply, "but I've learned that leadership often requires choosing between different types of loss. The question isn't whether you'll have regrets, but whether you can live with the consequences of the choices you make. And you believe excluding Edward was the right choice, despite the consequences for our family relationships?" "I believe it was the necessary choice," he replied, though Charlotte detected a note of uncertainty that suggested he was still wrestling with the decision himself. Whether it proves to be the right choice will depend largely on how Edward responds to this experience and what he learns from it. As evening approached, Charlotte began the elaborate process of dressing for the ceremony. The formal gown was a masterpiece of royal couture, with intricate beadwork that caught the light with every movement, and a train that would require careful management as she moved through the formal spaces of the palace. Her hair had been arranged in an elegant updo that would properly showcase the Cambridge sapphire tiara, and her makeup had been applied with the subtle precision that royal appearances demanded. When Lady Margaret finally placed the sapphire necklace around Charlotte's throat and secured the matching earrings, Charlotte felt the full weight of the moment settling upon her. These jewels had been worn by queens and princesses who had shaped the course of British history, and now she was being entrusted with continuing that legacy. "You look magnificent, Your Highness," Lady Margaret said with genuine warmth. "Every inch a princess." Charlotte examined herself in the full-length mirror, noting how the deep blue of the sapphires seemed to make her eyes more vivid and how the diamonds caught the light with every breath she took. She should have felt beautiful and confident, ready to accept an honor that represented years of dedicated service to the crown. Instead, she felt incomplete, as if an essential part of the evening was missing. A soft knock at the door announced Richard's arrival to escort her to the ceremony. He entered wearing his full dress uniform, complete with the medals and honors that marked his position as heir to the throne. But Charlotte could see the tension in his face that suggested the events of the previous evening continued to weigh on him. "You look absolutely radiant," he said, though his smile seemed forced. "Are you ready?" "As ready as I can be, given the circumstances," Charlotte replied, accepting his offered arm. As they made their way through the palace corridors toward the throne room, Charlotte found herself thinking about all the royal women who had walked these same halls throughout the centuries. She wondered if any of them had felt the same mixture of honor and regret that was currently filling her heart, whether any of them had been forced to choose between duty and family loyalty in ways that left them feeling torn and incomplete. "Richard," she said quietly as they paused outside the throne room doors, "I need you to know that Edward's absence tonight doesn't feel right to me. It feels like we're sacrificing family unity for the sake of making a point that could have been made in a dozen other ways." Richard's expression grew more serious, and Charlotte could see that her words had touched on concerns he had been harboring himself. "I know you feel that way, and I respect your position. But, Charlotte, there are aspects of Edward's recent behavior that you may not be fully aware of. The decision to exclude him wasn't made lightly or without serious consideration of the consequences." "What aspects?" Charlotte pressed, sensing that there were details about Edward's situation that hadn't been shared with her. Richard glanced around to ensure they were alone, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "There have been concerns about some of his university friends and their potential connections to individuals who might seek to exploit their relationship with Edward for financial or political gain. Nothing proven, nothing criminal, but enough to raise serious questions about his judgment in choosing associates." Charlotte felt a chill run through her as she began to understand the deeper implications of what Richard was telling her. The royal family's constant vulnerability to exploitation by individuals seeking money, information, or influence was one of the most serious ongoing security concerns they faced. "Has Edward been made aware of these specific concerns?" she asked. "That was the primary focus of our conversation last evening," Richard replied. "He was surprised by some of the information we shared with him. I believe it was genuinely helpful for him to understand why his casual approach to friendships and social activities has been causing such concern among our security advisors." This revelation cast Edward's exclusion from the ceremony in a different light, though Charlotte still felt that the approach could have been handled with more sensitivity to family relationships. If there were legitimate security concerns, those should have been addressed directly with Edward rather than using his exclusion from family events as a teaching tool. "How did he take the news?" she asked. "Better than I expected, honestly," Richard admitted. He was hurt and disappointed about missing tonight's ceremony, but he seemed to understand why certain changes in his behavior are necessary. He actually thanked me for being direct with him about the concerns rather than allowing him to continue making mistakes unknowingly. Charlotte felt a surge of pride in her youngest brother's maturity, even as she continued to wish that the situation could have been handled differently. And going forward, we've agreed on some specific guidelines for his social activities and associations, along with regular check-ins to ensure that any concerns are addressed promptly rather than being allowed to escalate, Richard explained. The goal is to help him navigate university life while being more aware of the potential risks and consequences of his choices. Before Charlotte could respond, the throne room doors opened, and she heard the quiet murmur of conversation from the assembled guests. The moment had arrived for her to step into her role and accept the honor that awaited her, regardless of the complex emotions surrounding the circumstances. The throne room had been arranged with understated elegance for the ceremony. The guests, a carefully selected group of family members and senior palace officials, stood in a semicircle around the ornate chairs where Charlotte and her father would sit for the formal presentation. Charlotte recognized many of the faces: her Uncle Andrew, her aunt, and various cousins who serve in official capacities, and the palace staff who have been part of her life since childhood. King William stood beside the throne, holding a leather case that contained the jewels that would be formally presented to her. The sight of her father in his full ceremonial regalia, surrounded by the symbols of monarchy that would someday be his to command, filled Charlotte with a mixture of awe and anticipation that temporarily pushed aside her concerns about Edward's absence. As Richard escorted her to her designated position, Charlotte caught sight of Mrs. Henderson in the assembled group, the elderly woman's face beaming with pride and affection. Next to her stood James Crawford, the palace private secretary, whose presence represented the institutional continuity that bound together generations of royal service. Distinguished guests, King William began, his voice carrying the authority and warmth that made him such an effective representative of the crown. We are gathered this evening to recognize the exceptional service and dedication that Princess Charlotte has demonstrated in her role as a senior member of the royal family. Charlotte felt her heart racing as her father continued with a formal recitation of her accomplishments over the past several years. Her charitable work, her diplomatic missions, her representation of the family at state occasions, all of it was detailed with the precision and gravity that such ceremonies demanded. It is therefore my privilege and honor, King William continued, opening the leather case to reveal the glittering collection of sapphires and diamonds, to present Princess Charlotte with these pieces from the Crown Jewels collection, which will be held in trust for the crown and worn by Her Royal Highness in the execution of her official duties. As her father lifted the Cambridge sapphire tiara and placed it carefully on her head, Charlotte felt the weight of history settling around her like a mantle. The cool touch of the precious metal against her skin was a physical reminder of the generations of royal women who had worn these same jewels in service to their people. The necklace followed, then the earrings and brooch, each piece accompanied by a brief explanation of its historical significance and the occasions when it had been worn by previous generations. Charlotte was struck by the continuity represented by these jewels, the way they connected her to queens and princesses spanning centuries, all of whom had faced their own challenges in balancing personal desires with public duties. When the formal presentation was complete, Charlotte rose to deliver the brief remarks she had prepared. Looking out at the assembled guests, she felt the weight of expectation and tradition that surrounded every word she spoke. I'm deeply honored by this recognition and by the trust that is being placed in me through these magnificent jewels, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the ornate room. I understand that wearing pieces from the Crown Jewels collection is not just a privilege, but a responsibility to uphold the dignity and service that they represent. As she continued with her prepared remarks, Charlotte found herself thinking about Edward and wishing that he could be there to share in this moment. Despite the security concerns and behavioral issues that had led to his exclusion, she knew that seeing her honored in this way would have filled him with genuine pride and happiness. These jewels connect me to generations of royal women who have served with dedication and grace, Charlotte continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke from her heart rather than from her prepared text. I hope to prove worthy of their legacy and to wear these pieces in a manner that honors both their historical significance and the family traditions they represent. The ceremony concluded with a reception in an adjacent room, where Charlotte circulated among the guests, accepting congratulations and discussing the significance of the evening's events. The conversations were warm and congratulatory, but Charlotte found herself constantly aware of the absence that cast a shadow over what should have been an entirely joyful occasion. As the evening drew to a close and the guests began to depart, Charlotte found herself alone with her father in the now quiet throne room. The jewels had been carefully removed and returned to their secure cases, but she could still feel their weight around her throat and the touch of the tiara against her forehead. "How do you feel?" King William asked, settling into one of the chairs with the exhaustion that always followed formal ceremonies. "Honored," Charlotte replied honestly. "Grateful, but also incomplete." Her father nodded, and she could see that he understood exactly what she meant. Edward will have other opportunities for recognition and honor. This was your moment, and you handled it with the grace and dignity that I've always known you possessed. Thank you, Father. But I hope that future family ceremonies will find ways to include all of us, even when individual behavior requires correction or guidance. King William was quiet for a moment, and Charlotte could see him considering her words and the broader implications of the evening's events. "Perhaps you're right," he said finally. "Perhaps there are ways to balance institutional requirements with family unity that we haven't fully explored." As Charlotte prepared to leave the throne room, she caught sight of her reflection in one of the gilt mirrors that lined the walls. Even without the jewels, she could see the change that the evening had brought, a new sense of responsibility and purpose that would shape her approach to royal duties going forward. But she could also see the determination in her own eyes to ensure that future milestones would be shared with both of her brothers, that the bonds of family would not be sacrificed for the sake of institutional messaging or disciplinary measures. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to strengthen the relationships that mattered most to her. Tonight had marked a significant step forward in her royal journey, but it had also reinforced her commitment to ensuring that duty and love could coexist in the complex world of royal service. As she walked through the palace corridors one final time that evening, Charlotte found herself thinking about Edward and hoping that the distance between them caused by tonight's ceremony would prove temporary. The crown jewel she had been honored to wear represented centuries of royal tradition, but the family bonds that connected her to her brothers were equally precious and deserving of protection and care. The weight of the sapphires and diamonds had been significant, but the weight of leadership and responsibility that came with them would prove far heavier in the days and years to come. Charlotte only hoped that she would prove equal to both challenges, serving the crown with dedication while preserving the family relationships that gave her life meaning and joy beyond the glittering world of royal duty.